Thanks to the foundation for helping to sponsor this event, and to Miroslav and to everybody else who's made this possible. Thanks for inviting me. It's been fun. Yeah, it is still fun, even though it's 8 a.m.
If you agree.
So I gave you a hand. Did everyone get a handout? I made a handout that just has a lot of the relevant bits and pieces on it. I don't want to talk through the whole thing, obviously, but I thought I would start off by kind of talking through the beginning portion, because I think that for me was an interesting part of the project. So I accepted the invitation to do this a while back, and then of course when it came to actually writing it, I read the invitation letter more closely, and then I realized that we were supposed to focus not just on Professor Moltmann's piece, and on the notion of expectation, but to kind of center in on the idea of pregnancy or expecting in the biological sense. And having not had that experience myself, I figured I would talk to a friend who is at Cornell, who is in the middle of that experience. And she's also an interesting case because, as you saw in the paper, she's somebody who works on kind of geographies of the future, if you want. So she thinks about climate change and climate policy. She does some actual modeling and has a background in climate science, but is now doing a little bit more of the kind of anthropology of it, and introduced me to this term. I guess I had heard about it maybe a couple years ago, but hadn't looked too closely to this term, the Anthropocene, which is this idea that I think a geochemist introduced not that long ago, 20 years or so ago, of an epoch, a geological epoch really, in which humanity has become such a force in nature or in the world, maybe not in the universe, but on this planet, that we can think of it as powerful as a kind of geologic force, and so as characterizing a kind of epoch in which there will be mass extinctions and so forth. And the reason that was of interest was because the narratives of the Anthropocene, especially in her field, tend to be pretty dystopian, tend to be pretty pessimistic. So the thought is, various cataclysms will at some point be inevitable, peak fossil fuel, but also just climate change and so forth. And that this will cause a reduction in the carrying capacity of the Earth or some other kind of major thing, unless we can come up with technological solutions which seem increasingly unlikely or something like that. And there's some extremism about it, and a lot of the people involved are kind of post-Marxists or maybe still Marxists, and so they like the idea of cataclysms followed by unpredictable eschatologies. But it is a pessimistic kind of discussion, and there's a lot of hand-wringing and anger, talk about policy change, but frustration at how slow it is, even when you elect a president who seemed to think that there was going to be hope and change. So she then, in the context of this, is confronted also in Ithaca, which is a very kind of lefty, hippie town, and has a lot of people who are kind of opting out of various things, including the having of children. There are quite a few people who think that it's actually morally questionable, and not just in Ithaca. I've talked to people in a lot of contexts who think that it's morally questionable to have a child in the current context, given population growth, and the fact that especially a northern child in our context, in the middle class context that we were talking about yesterday, will be a huge consumer of resources, much more than a kind of a child in other contexts will. So she was sort of confronted by this and actually was moved by it for a while, but then last year decided to go ahead and start expecting, and is now expecting, and is in her 6th month. And so it was interesting to talk to her about expectation and what that means for someone who's expecting and who also works on the Anthropocene and had been a little bit more pessimistic. So she now thinks that her name is Holly Jean Buck. I'm sorry, I should have named her. Her name is Holly Jean Buck. She's in the development sociology department at Cornell. She thinks about her near-term expectations, so kind of things you can predict, think of as probable, about what'll be involved in setting up a nursery and what'll be involved in having a baby in a very near-term sort of way. And she has some near-term hopes, of course, about how it will be to give birth and what it will be like to try to keep doing her work and also have a young child. And she's willing to talk about long-term hopes for her child, that it will have a good life at least, and that it will flourish in some way. But she doesn't want to think of those as, or she basically tries to bracket long-term expectations, because when she thinks about them, she finds herself realistically thinking negative thoughts, perhaps because of this backdrop, disciplinary backdrop in geography. So I thought that was interesting that she was like, well, I don't really have, or if I have long-term expectations, I can't think about them while I'm expecting. And so I tried to reflect here in the paper a little bit on the way in which expecting might lead you to have to focus on your long-term hopes rather than long-term expectations, especially in the Anthropocene. She has a couple of nice passages that I quote in a paper where she's reflecting on what she calls the possibilities of a charming Anthropocene. And she's not naive. She realizes that large-scale political change would still be important, but she likes to try to imagine a new kind of human being, a more humane human being, if you want, than the homo consumens, who is the kind of protagonist of a lot of the narratives of the Anthropocene. So she talks about someone who would be a human nature that would be human traits like tending, altruism, creativity, art and craftsmanship, and cooperation, reclaiming their status as basic human nature, as opposed to focusing on the rapacious antagonist of the horror stories who has shaped environments in a variety of ways throughout history. It's a really interesting piece, and it's not, I mean, there's no obvious solution that someone like Holly can just offer to the problems that face us, but it's interesting that in the context of expecting a child, she found that she had to do something, even in a scholarly vein, to articulate some of these long-term hopes. And so I then try to suggest that we, in the contemporary situation, clearly distinguish between notions of expectation and of hope. And you can see that in the case of this person who is herself expecting in an interesting way. And so then in the paper I go on to describe this, what I call the classical conflation between these notions that I think have now come out a bit more clearly in contemporary and more recent modern context. It looks as though, and I'm happy to be corrected by experts in the room who know the classical tradition better than I do, but it looks as though there's a kind of Greek concept, elpis, that is at the bottom of both of these terms, expectation and hope, and that has a number of characteristics that we would now associate with both, but more carefully distinguish. So that's why I talk about a classical conflation. And there's some quotations here. In the value of having expectation or hope category, we see some ancient ambivalence. So there's the thought that this is something that's not present that you're focused on, that it's something that is not fully under your control, that it's something that could lead you astray. And so in all of the ancients, the myth of Pandora especially, this kind of interesting ambivalence about elpis, about having expectation or hope, whether it's a curse or whether it's the blessing that helps us deal with all of the other curses from the gods. And then the clear articulation in the Stoic tradition of the kind of negative assessment of anything that is kind of focused on the uncertain future. Even if it's probable, I guess they would suggest it's still not something that we should fixate on. We look for tranquility, ataraxia in the present, which is the only thing that can make no man or woman presumably wretched, according to the Stoics. So there's the question of whether it's good or not to have this state, and then there's the question of whether the object of the state has to be good. So I try to distinguish those. In the second case, it looks as though that's conflated too in the contemporary discussion of elpis, again, because this is just this one concept really that seems to go to comprehend both of what we would call expectation and hope. So it looks as though Aristotle says you can hope for evil, which sounds very strange to us, right? So it sounds like we would have to translate that as expecting evil, but also elpis, have hope for a good. We use expectation in this neutral way with respect to its object. So I give you this somewhat strange sentence, which I think still sounds linguistically okay. I expect to have ice cream at the end of my final meal, after which I expect my own execution, which is presumably a bad, right? So you can both expect the good and the bad. But it sounds very strange without a lot more qualification to say that you hope for something that you take to be bad unmitigatedly for yourself. So elpis, this Greek term in the New Testament, shows up much less ambiguously and ambivalently. It becomes something that is both good to have and that is always directed at what is at least perceived to be good, typically in Paul's hands towards something regarding the afterlife. And so that word is now translated by New Testament interpreters as hope, typically, rather than expectation. So then I go on to discuss a kind of third feature of this concept, or these concepts, the doxastic feature. Doxastic just means belief, or if you want the kind of propositional cognitive component of the attitude. And the thought here is just that in the contemporary context, we seem to distinguish pretty clearly between what it is you believe when you expect and what it is you believe when you hope for something. So I might expect something, and it would be very strange to say, I expect this, but I don't think it's going to happen. It seems as though expectation connotes now the belief that, or involves, or is constituted by the belief that something is at least 50-50 or a little better than 50-50, all the way up to certainty. That's the kind of thought that I think you see in some of the ancient and early modern authors, but not as consistently as you'd think. There is also I think they are relatively consistent about expectation when they are in the early modern period using that term. What they seem to be ambivalent or ambiguous about is the notion of hope, or the doxastic component of hope. And so I've listed some of the people here who say something about hope in the modern period. Aquinas sounds more contemporary in that he thinks that, all you have to believe is that the thing is possible, and then there's also going to be an affective component of desire or passion or something like that. Whereas some of the others in the modern period retain that kind of classical conflation between hope and expectation and seem to sometimes articulate the notion of hope as though it has the doxastic component of belief that the thing is likely. So Calvin says that hope is nothing else than the expectation of those things which faith has believed to have been truly promised by God. And I noticed that I have Calvin and Hobbes there, which is not something that I intended, but it just happened. Hobbes says hope is an appetite with the opinion of attaining, so maybe you're not certain that you'll attain it, but it looks probable to you that you're going to attain it. You have the opinion of attaining it. And Descartes and Locke seem to think of it as involving probability. In the OED, you still get this definition of hope as involving an expectation of something with desire, a feeling of trust or confidence in it. So I think there's still a little bit of ambiguity in the concept, maybe even in the contemporary scene, though I think most contemporary philosophers and just common linguistic usage suggest that hope is something merely regarded as possible, or at least possible, or maybe more carefully, it has to be something which you are not certain to be impossible, if you want. And then there's going to be an affective component as well. That affective component in the medievals and early moderns is described in different ways. Spinoza's definition is kind of interesting. It's similar to Hume's. The idea is that hope is a joy. It's a kind of joy, but it's a joy that's inconstant. It kind of fluctuates. So as you consider the good that you're hoping for, you kind of feel a joy or an anticipation of joy. There's a kind of enlivening or animation of the affective faculty. But then as you consider the fact that it's merely possible, or at least not certain, you then are kind of fluctuating back into something like fear or worry about disappointment. And so it has this inconstancy to it that makes some early modern philosophers, especially someone like Spinoza, inspired by a Stoic picture, think of it as undesirable. Better to have constant joy in a recognition of the kind of necessitarian picture of the universe that he gives us in the first part of the Ethics. Okay, and then, the contemporary discussion of hope, which is quite small, people discuss the affective component a little bit. I mean, they basically think that it's a belief that the thing is possible plus a desire for it. And then there's kind of a lot of discussion about some third component which might be important, like maybe you have to actively imagine the thing coming about, or be disposed to be disappointed if it doesn't come about, or something like that. But the classical conflation definitely goes away for the most part in the contemporary scene. So then I turn to two case studies in the conflation that do remain in, and this is especially the conflation with respect to the doxastic component that remain in the one case, the 18th century, and the other case, the 21st century. Maybe I won't go through the proof here because it's laid out there and in the paper, but the point with respect to Kant, and this is, I should say, just one way, a way that I find interesting to reconstruct the way in which Kant thinks we might have moral justification for believing in the existence of God. There's this interesting double entendre on the term demoralizing that Robert Adams kind of started this way of talking about the proof in terms of demoralization. So the thought is you lose your energy, your moral motivation, if you start to come to think that you can't even rationally hope for something like a just society or a just resolution, or at least an eschatological promise of something, of a state in which virtue is correlated in some way with happiness. It looks as though this current situation is not one in which virtue and happiness are correlated in any really clear way. You have a lot of finance people in New York who seem very happy, and a lot of virtuous people who sometimes suffer, unfortunately. And so the wicked prosper and the virtuous are not always happy. And so Kant thinks, unlike the Stoics, that virtue is not its own reward. We have to then think that it would be demoralizing not to think of a state in which the virtuous are in some way happy. And this leads him to think that it has to be in an afterlife with God in control and establishing this just situation. I just suggest here that the argument doesn't really work if you start with mere rational hope, that all you get is 10 prime, that faith that God's existence is really possible is morally justified, rather than faith that God's existence is actual. This seems to be something that Kant didn't really notice, although as I go on at the end of the paper to say, he does then later say, maybe all we need is the faith that God's existence is really possible. So perhaps he did notice it, but when he articulates the proof, he always seems to think that he gets us to faith that God's existence is morally justified. And that suggests that he's maybe conflating the attitudes involved in hope and faith, and maybe starting with a premise that's stronger than mere hope. Then I go on to just briefly talk about David Kelsey in his really amazing theological anthropology that I read a couple years ago in response to another invitation from Yale, and talked about at a colloquium there. And just point out here I won't go through this, but he's got this eschatological picture according to which hope is the proper response to what God has done in history and in Jesus Christ in particular. But that hope is always, and maybe this is because it's inspired by a kind of Calvinist vision, that hope is always in Kelsey's hands, he calls it eccentric, but there's a list in my paper on page 14 of some of the things he says about it, and it always sounds much more like expectation, an attitude of expectancy that a good and desired transformation of our quotidian context will be fully actualized. Joyous, glad hopefulness, not a gleeful hopefulness, but a happy hope, not a euphoric hope, a cheerful confidence, personal body's orientation that disposes them for enactments of certain practices. So it looks as though in his discussion of what an eccentric hope would be, that it's got a lot of that kind of expectation aspect to it, a kind of confidence that the thing hoped for is going to occur. And so I just kind of raised the question about whether this is an adequate account of hope or whether it's really necessary, whether it's theologically required. I'll just skip the part about Bonaventure and then talk about the last page of the handout very briefly. So Kant, as I said, says in a few places that what's really, so he says, interestingly, in the first critique, that the question for the philosophy of religion is, what may we hope? What may I hope? And says that it's, of course, a question about what's rational to hope, so what may I hope? And then goes on to talk about the moral proof for God's existence in the moral world and so forth. And though I said he sometimes seems to trade in the classical conflation and talk more about expectation or belief, it looks as though in some places he recognizes that there could be this minimal picture of what it is to be religious, at least doxastically, namely the belief that God's existence is really possible. Some people who have noticed this kind of complain about it and think that this is too low of a standard for true religion, that merely believing that God's existence is metaphysically possible is something that agnostics can do or atheists can do, and that this shouldn't be even a kind of acceptable minimum. So I try to suggest at the end of the paper that there might be a way in which, if it's combined with some of the affective components that we discussed in the context of looking at the notion of hope, could be an account of what it is to be both rational or authentic to doubts that might make your expectations seem unrealistic, or might make someone like Kelsey's expectations seem too robust or something like that, but still kind of affectively shaping your life, still engaging with the gears of your moral motivation in the right way, still kind of shaping your approach to the world and to your role in the world. So the thought would be, that's not going to fit into a kind of baldly atheistic framework. Even if you could share the doxastic component, maybe people believe that God's existence, like ghosts and Santa Claus and the tooth fairy, all these things are possible. But a kind of genuinely religious appropriation of that belief might be accompanied by all sorts of affective and action guiding states that you could think of as much more robust and part of a kind of religious hope that I think would be satisfying and not appallingly kind of low as a standard for religion. Back to the Anthropocene, I just say it might also involve hope for the advent of a new kind of human being, not mere homo consumens, but rather one that actively works to turn our geologic home into something charming again. So that might be one, if you're thinking about the Anthropocene and some of those dystopian narratives, that might be one object of the hope. Again, something you merely believe to be possible, but somehow shape your affective and agential life around. This in sympathy with Professor Moltmann's point in the paper that, quote, every child is also a new occasion for hope for the home, the Heimat of life in this unredeemed world. Something, again, that doesn't seem like anything we could expect given all of the disappointment that both God and we have witnessed over the years, but still something that we hope for and that can count as a religious kind of hope. So then my final plea at the end is for a resistance to the classical conflation on the grounds that it would impoverish our picture of at least some of the ways in which people might be authentically religious. I'm not suggesting that believing is bad or having faith is bad. Maybe that is the ideal. Maybe it's the kind of saintly thing that we should even aspire to. So in the spirit of, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief, we might think that at certain times anyway, belief and expectation isn't under our control in the face of trauma, in the face of great evil, in the face of the fact that the wicked prosper and the virtuous suffer. We may not be able to expect much or believe even in God's existence sometimes. Typically in epistemology, people are persuaded that belief is not something that is really under your control. It's a response to the perceived presence of certain kinds of evidence. So what to do in that situation in a kind of religious mode? Well, it seems as though, believing that things are possible is a lot easier than believing that things are going to happen or that they do exist. And that maybe that kind of belief is a modal belief might be the kind of thing that you could even take practical steps to kind of generate in yourself. And so I talk about liturgical practices in a Pascalian mode that might lead us to belief, at least that these things seem possible. They're kind of become palpable for us in a certain way. And then a kind of effort to shape your affective life in the mode of hope around that reflection on those modal beliefs, the beliefs that these things are possible. So maybe there are good days when you fully believe and have full confidence in that kind of Kelsey way and feel the cheerful, expectation of all these great goods. But maybe there are a lot of days, at least for me, when you're quite a bit more skeptical or ambivalent. And I think it would be good for theologians and philosophers of religion to think about a way of being religious that would accommodate the fact that sometimes that sort of hope, which is still a robust mode of hope, is what kind of characterizes our religious life. And so then I end by saying maybe philosophers of religion should join the theologians and the geographers and the social scientists and psychologists in thinking a little bit more about what hope is and could be, especially as a kind of authentic, honest mode of religious expression.